You're listening to The Sacred Sofa, a podcast that explores all things theology and therapy. My name is Grace Brown. I'm a registered psychotherapist, certified Canadian counselor, and owner of Journey with Grace Counseling Services.
And I'm Brad Watson, pastor of Nexus Church and author of the book, A Path Called Compelling. Welcome to The Sacred Sofa.
Well, hello, Brad. Hello. Welcome back, Brad, and our listeners to another season of The Sacred Sofa. I hope you had a wonderful summer because we're very rapidly approaching the fall.
Yes, we certainly are. And yes, Grace, it is fantastic to be back. I'm very excited about this, getting into fall rhythms and routines. I had a great summer, a wonderful summer. The batteries are fully recharged. What about you? You feeling refreshed?
I did have a wonderful summer, did some traveling, stayed local as well, and spent a lot of time in nature, even though it was blazing hot, but that's the way I like it. So,
You like the heat, eh? You like the heat.
burn me up, Brad. But yeah,
Oh,
I
that's
absolutely
good.
had a really great summer, and it's always great
Good.
to come back into more of the fall, even in terms of routine. And so
Mm-hmm.
I'm
Mm-hmm.
very happy to be doing another season with you on the Sacred Sofa. And thank you again to our
Yeah.
listeners who support us
Yeah.
and tune in. So let's get after it. Where are we heading
Okay.
this fall, Brad?
Okay. Yeah. Let's do this. Well, I want to start with story, Grace, because I had an interesting occurrence happen a few years ago. I was invited to a Christmas party. It was a work party for my wife, and I was introduced to some of her colleagues, but one person in particular, a very eccentric individual. When I met him for the first time, he said, "Nice to meet you, Brad. What is your story?"
Hmm.
Now, I have never had anyone open a conversation with "What is your story?" And I'll be honest, he kind of left me a little tongue tied because I wasn't sure how to respond to that. Well, like,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Are you looking for biographical details? Do I start at the beginning where I was born? Like I wasn't sure I had a story. And even if I did have a story, I wasn't sure how to tell it.
Mm-hmm.
So it sort of got me thinking, life as a story, what would that mean? And I'm also intrigued by a quote that's attributed to Lillian Bell, although we're not quite sure where it came from. But the saying goes like this: life is just one damn thing after another.
Mm.
And I don't know about you, but sometimes my days, my weeks can feel like that, like just okay, another meeting, another email, just everything piled on top of each
Mm-hmm.
other, and it can just feel like sometimes there's not a whole lot of a plot line going on
Mm-hmm.
connecting my days and weeks and all that stuff. And so I thought we would start with this season exploring story, life as story, and we'll see where that takes us. But maybe I thought I would throw it back to you here, Grace. Why do you think so many of us struggle to tell our own story? And for someone like me, does our uncertainty about our plot line, so to speak, in life, do you think it has an effect on our identity and mental health?
Hmm. Really good questions. And before I go there, I just want to say that quote by Lillian Bell,
Yeah.
that hit me. I felt that
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
absolutely life can just feel like one damn thing after another.
Yes.
Really? Because
Yeah.
life be
Yeah.
lifing, as they say. And it's just like,
Yes.
okay, I'm tired.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, absolutely, I felt that. And in terms of your question, it's like you mentioned earlier. I think we're almost socialized or programmed to be ready to share certain information, right? When
Mm-hmm.
you're asked that
Mm-hmm.
question, it throws you off because we're outside of our usual programming. You
Right.
know, I'm sure you remember questions you felt pressured to answer as you were finishing high school, right?
Mm.
What are you doing after you graduate? Oh, college,
Yeah.
university? What will you be studying? Like we have
Mm.
this routine of things that we just sort of answer
Mm-hmm.
habitually. And after that, it's what do you do?
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's
Mm-hmm.
only in certain circumstances or settings that the deeper question of who you are asked or even listened to. And I think
Mm.
this eccentric fellow, he just want to
Yes.
get right to the
Yeah.
realness, and
Yes.
asking that. And so, you know, asking who you are is important. And without realizing what we do often becomes our identity versus the who that we are.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so I think many folks are so focused on the doing, they lose sight of their true identity and ultimately the why, right?
Absolutely.
Most of our what we're doing is off balance. We've talked in previous episodes about the hyperproductivity and the lack of healthy boundaries that can very much lead us to feeling burnt out, even a
Mm.
crisis of identity and confusion and uncertainty about the why we're
Mm-hmm.
doing. And
Mm-hmm.
all of this absolutely will impact one's mental and physical health.
Yeah, it's funny, just even as you're talking there, I'm realizing, Grace, that by the way we ask questions, whether it's after high school or about what you do, is we're kind of being handed a script, right? Like
Mm-hmm,
a
mm-hmm,
certain, here's your story. Is it college or university? You going into the trades, or what do you do is often a script for, I will kind of define you by what you do. So it's kind
mm-hmm,
of interesting. And, we
mm-hmm,
don't think a lot about that. But as I've been thinking about the nature of story is not just a list of events or happenings, right?
mm-hmm,
Like it's not a grocery list. It's weave together the events and happenings of our lives, weave together with some kind of plot line. And I've heard it said that the heart of story, the engine of every story is conflict. Now,
mm-hmm,
that might not sound good, but if you consider, for instance, you go home, you tell your family, your loved ones about your day, chances are the stories you tell involve some kind of conflict. Now, it
mm-hmm,
might be funny. Hey, some
mm-hmm,
guy butted in front of me at Costco or whatever, or you wouldn't believe what my boss said to me today. It's
mm-hmm,
usually a story of some sort of conflict. We're internally conflicted about something, there's a relational conflict. Even when we tell stories about travel. Like one of the difficult things I find is, we even open talking about this. How was your summer? Well, it was good, but how do you get a story out of that, right? Like you
mm-hmm,
kind of got to get deeper to find a story there. And yet, when it comes to our lives, so often I think we understand how to make stories day to day, but we're missing a plot line for our lives. Like even when I think about when I introduce myself or people ask questions, like I could tell you I'm an INFJ on the Myers Briggs, or I'm an Enneagram 6. I have 3 kids, a wife, a dog, but that
mm-hmm,
almost says nothing about me.
mm-hmm,
And so I think to know someone, to find identity in life, there's got to be a story. And for a story, there's got to be a plot line.
mm-hmm,
And for a plot line, there's got to be some sort of conflict. So, first of all, I want to ask you some questions about that from your cycle with a psychological lens.
mm-hmm.
Might reframing life as a conflict in a story, might reframing, sorry, our struggles in life as a conflict in a story, do you think that might change the way we experience suffering or hardships? Like,
Hmm.
might it help people reinterpret personal conflict as meaningful rather than, say, random pain? And then, of course, I'm wondering sort of the opposite. Is there potential dangers for thinking about life in terms of story? Like, can you over narrate hardship or try to
Hmm.
force a plot line on our lives
Hmm.
too quickly? Like, are there some pros and cons here with thinking about life as a story?
Hmm. Interesting questions and reflections for sure. But I would say yes, stories I believe are incredibly important in all aspects of life.
Hmm.
And in psychotherapy, there are multiple interventions and modalities that actually invite stories.
Hmm.
So, for example, narrative therapy,
Hmm.
helps people process the challenges of their life story by,
Hmm.
in parts, validating their grief moments, exploring negative experience and trauma, and also helps them discover their strengths and values and opportunities for growth,
Hmm.
exploring the light and the shadow in a
Hmm.
story. And through this and other interventions, sometimes people can actually learn to reinterpret their
Hmm.
conflict, their tragedies as meaningful rather than just some random pain.
Hmm.
Now, that being said, it's not always possible to find meaning, right?
Hmm.
Sometimes it's
Hmm.
just tragedy.
Right.
In terms of your second question, yes, again, it is possible to over narrate and then push for a plot line or the meaning way too soon.
Hmm.
Grief is a necessary process to go through for our healing process. And
Hmm.
even though it doesn't feel good and we don't like it, and there's so many misbeliefs and myths that kind of take us off track in terms of our grief journey, it is necessary to go through. And
Hmm.
this journey also requires some balance.
Hmm.
Recently, I've been reading a book by John W. James and Russell Friedman. And the book is called The Grief Recovery Method Handbook. And
Hmm.
so they've sort of revolutionized this idea and concept of grief and grief recovery.
Hmm.
And
Okay.
in this book, they explain there are two key dangers in processing grief. One is the danger of enshrinement
Hmm.
and bedevilment. And so this
Huh.
goes to that polarization of what you were talking about, the stories of our grief. In enshrinement, that's when a person only focuses on the fond memories of a loss. They're
Hmm.
building memorials and they don't allow themselves to look at all aspects of the relationship. It's only the positive.
Hmm.
In bedevilment, it's a litany of complaints detailing a lifetime of mistreatment, negative experiences. They're unwilling to let go of disappointment and anger. They're clinging to the negative.
Hmm.
And that's again unbalanced view of relationships that are often negative and positive.
Right.
And they do have a quote that says all relationships include both positive and negative interactions. And you can only complete grief by being totally honest with yourself and others. And this concept is the same in all the stories of our life, Brad. I don't
Hmm.
know any story that doesn't have the theme of grief, which is any form of loss.
Hmm.
And that's
Hmm.
where
Hmm.
the conflict sort of drives the story of our lives.
Right, right. Yeah, and we're going to get to some plot lines a little later. I'll say that I've got some stuff I want to ask you about there, but that's some fascinating stuff. That sounds like a good book, especially for
Hmm.
those maybe
Hmm.
right in the middle of dealing with grief or loss, if it's right in front of them at the moment. Now, I want to talk to you a little bit too. You talked about narrative therapy. That's not
Hmm.
something, to be honest, that I'd heard of, but I have heard of the term the narrative self, which I
Hmm.
think is a term that's borrowed maybe even from that specific field of psychology.
Hmm.
But the definition I have of it is your narrative self is your personal, internalized story that gives your life a sense of unity and purpose by integrating past experiences and anticipating the future.
Hmm.
Now, I'm coming at this as a pastor. I'm interested in this from a theological perspective and framework, but I'm curious about this from your end and where this sort of maybe emerged or came from in the psychological world. So, can you
Hmm.
maybe tell us how psychology, your field, understands the narrative self and what happens to us when our internal story becomes fragmented or incoherent? And tell us even maybe a little bit about how therapy, like you mentioned, can help us reauthor our life story. What would that look like?
Hmm. So the narrative self, in short, it's the story you tell yourself and the meaning you make of those stories.
Hmm.
The thing is, everything that happens to us is not only about the event, but the meaning we make of the event.
Hmm.
And sometimes the meaning we make can become skewed, shall I say that, in a person's sense of self, can become flawed due to other influences or misbeliefs that we develop from other experiences or messages we get from other people.
Hmm.
Okay.
Hmm.
And so the process of therapy can help a person identify what are those misbeliefs that they're continuing to build life on or try to build life on
Hmm.
and rediscover a healthy sense of self and how they can then influence the trajectory of their story.
Hmm.
So let me use the same example of grief. And this
Hmm.
goes back to James Friedman's book, The Grief Method Recovery. Um, James and Friedman help people identify myths and cliches that people internalize from external messaging. So, for
Hmm.
example,
Okay.
myths such as you have to be strong for others.
Hmm.
That response, if you buy into it, actually invalidates your own grief process in the pursuit of trying to help support someone else. And
Hmm.
the reality is both need to exist in the
Right.
space. Okay. Some cliches that I'm sure you've heard in your course
Hmm.
of working with people processing grief and loss. Things happen for a reason. That one makes
Yeah.
my teeth grind. I'll be
Yeah.
honest.
Yeah.
Of course, things happen for a reason and for a lot of reasons.
uh,
Sometimes it's choices we make, sometimes it's choices other people make. It's not this vague sort of pie in the sky, like,
mm,
you know. And cliches are what James and Friedman say are intellectually true, but emotionally barren.
Ah, I like
I
that.
really like that. Some things can be intellectually true, but is it useful in this moment to help
Mm,
someone support someone
mm,
emotionally?
mm-hmm.
And they also go on to caution against what they call the Academy Reward Award recovery. And this is where people pretend to be recovered from their loss.
Oh.
I'm fine, right? You just put on a
Mm,
happy face. And so they warn against accepting these myths, cliches, and pretenses that only not only creates a false sense of self, but it then dismisses our own needs for emotional support and creates a guarded mistrust of others' ability to be there for us in genuine support.
mm,
And so, this whole process of acknowledging grief, loss, conflict in a story is necessary to process and with community, safe community, help us, identify those landmines that are tripping us up.
mm. This is fantastic stuff because again, if we start, Grace, from the hey, if somebody says to you, what is your story, like me, you're going to have a hard time maybe identifying that. But I think what we're getting at here, and you've highlighted so brilliantly, is oh, we're telling ourselves stories all the time. We're even
Yes.
living by certain stories. We might not just be aware of it. And
Mm-hmm.
those are some great examples that you just gave us, right? Like you have to be strong for others. That's a storyline that we put on
Mm-hmm.
ourselves, or, like those
Mm-hmm.
things are playing out. So the more we delve into story, the more I think we can understand how this goes. And
Mm-hmm.
I think for me, theologically, what's interesting is that the Jesus path, the gospel faith, the Christian faith, it's first presented as a story. So the
Mm-hmm.
first time in Acts that Peter is asked to talk to a Gentile, a foreign audience about this Jesus guy, he doesn't give them a list of beliefs. He doesn't give them a statement of faith or dogmas or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Very first thing he does is he tells a story and he becomes a sort of steward of the story. And so I'm hoping, as we progress this week and over the next few weeks, that we're going to kind of meld some theology and therapy stuff here, which I think
Mm-hmm.
will be fun. But there's something about, even in my own line of work, people will say to me often, oh, I remember that story you told. They might not remember, here were the three interesting intellectual points I made, but they might remember a
Right.
story, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious about that. Why do stories reach us more deeply than abstract ideas? And how do you, as a therapist, use storytelling or even restoring in
Mm-hmm.
clinical practice? Is there a role like for imagination in the work you do with people?
Absolutely. Because here's the thing, stories are relatable,
Mm,
right? And with curiosity and openness, we can often find a thread of connection from
mm,
ourselves to the others in their narration.
mm.
Stories invite hope and inspiration. Who doesn't love a great movie, Brad? Right?
Uh-huh.
Right? And then, so yes, the use of story is a witness to the resilience in other people's story.
Mm,
And throughout the therapeutic process, there are multiple modalities that will emphasize the use of stories in psychotherapy. So, for example,
mm.
I'm thinking when working with couples, one of the first thing is I ask them to tell me their story, right?
Huh.
Because they've come to
Uh-huh.
me because conflict has arisen in the relationship, largely. Sometimes I get some really great people who are proactive, and I
Yeah,
really love those
yeah,
too. But,
yeah.
often couples will come in the midst of conflict in their story. And
Mm-hmm.
so with story, I invite them to go back. How did you
Mm.
begin? How did you
Uh,
meet?
mm.
And so story is woven into that relatedness of life as humans.
Mm. Well, that's great, great idea. And when people show up, that's fascinating. Tell me your story in relationship. It's much
Mm-hmm.
easier sometimes to recount our story, right? So
Mm-hmm.
that's
Mm-hmm.
fascinating. Now, um, I'm a big fan of Brian Zahn. He's got this delightful poem about how the Bible and faith are story. I won't go and read the whole thing, but he ends the poem this way: if you allow the story, and by the story he's talking about Jesus past story. If you allow the story to seep into your life so that the story begins to weave into your story,
Mm.
that's when you're reading the Bible right, doing faith right.
Love that.
So, what I want to do, and you already mentioned movies, I'm going to be talking and bringing up lots of movies for us to interact with over the next few weeks there. Grace. But my hope for the next 2 months, because we're going to go about another 7 weeks on this theme for sure,
Mm-hmm.
as we explore the Jesus path as story, I'm hoping what it will do is give us what we need to find our own narrative self or a stronger sense of it,
Mm.
and help us uncover maybe narratives we're living into that might not be healthy, that sort of thing. But I'm hoping it will help us tie our story into a larger meta narrative. But
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious about that impulse as well, tying our story into something bigger and what the implications might be psychologically. So, whether it's a religious narrative, cultural, familial, the ways we use those stories to shape our personal stories,
Mm-hmm.
that can be, I'm assuming, maybe both healthy and harmful depending on the narrative. How
Mm-hmm.
do you discern, Grace, when someone is living into a story that seems to be setting them free, making them more healthy, versus one that is maybe making them, keeping them bound to something?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I believe it starts with understanding that our stories are automatically influenced by a larger narrative.
Hmm.
It begins with our home of origin stories, and
Hmm.
that can include any manner of larger narratives, such as religious, cultural, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
And then the belief systems that come from that larger narrative that we then internalize as part of our story creates belief systems. And those belief systems can be healthy or unhealthy.
Hmm.
One of the best indicators of whether it's healthy or unhealthy is the positive or negative impact these beliefs have on ourselves and others. That's
Hmm.
always a strong indicator of where we're landing.
Yeah, that makes sense to me, Grace, that the measurable impact of a story, how we're living out, is the impact
Mm.
it's having on us and others. Now, what I'm hoping to do over the next 7 weeks, we kind of set up the importance of stories here, is I want to explore our narrative self in the next few weeks using Christopher Booker's book entitled The Seven Basic Plots: Why We Tell Stories. Now,
Mm-hmm.
I'll be honest, I didn't get through this book. It's really dense. It's like a philosophy of storytelling and why we tell stories. But a
Okay.
lot of people hail it as a masterpiece because what he does really great work at doing is going through the stories that we've told since the beginning of time, right up to
Mm.
present day movies, and kind of dissecting them and saying humans really tell themselves one of seven stories. So, all stories that we tell, movies, books, TV shows, tend to fall into one of seven categories.
Okay.
So, what I thought we could do is explore each of those plot lines and then talk about how that might impact our own personal lives, our theology, that sort of stuff. So, I'll give you the seven plot lines. The first one is overcoming the monster.
Mm.
Now, Jaws turned 50 this year, and I had my kids watch it with me. That's a classic overcoming the monster story.
Right.
I hate horror films because they just scare me so much, but virtually every horror film is some kind of overcoming the monster
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
storyline. So we'll look at that next week. That's the first one. Then you've got your rags to riches story, from
Okay.
Cinderella to Slumdog Millionaire. Even, I loved that movie, Barbie. I had a great time watching it. Apparently, that is in essence a bit of a rags to riches story as well.
Okay.
Then you've got The Quest, all the way from Indiana Jones and the Quest for the Holy Grail. A lot of
Mm-hmm.
superhero movies are a quest. Oh, Brother, Where Art Thou by the Coen brothers.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Voyage and Return, movies like The Hobbit, Finding Nemo. I'm not sure if you saw Everything Everywhere All at Once. That fits into that storyline. Then you've got comedies, everything from slapstick Dumb and Dumber to, The Big Lebowski. Then you also have tragedy. That's the six of
Mm-hmm.
that. And I want to kind of land on this one for a bit because of what you talked about with grief and how tragedy is such, we
Mm.
love these stories, whether it's from Breaking Bad, the TV show, Shakespearean tragedies, even Oppenheimer, that movie that came out
Right.
recently,
Right.
kind
Mm-hmm.
of a tragedy. And one of the things that Booker points out is that as humans, we would rather our story be framed as tragedy than just meaninglessness.
Right.
So,
Mm-hmm.
in our grief, as we go through that process, yes, we can. This is an absolute tragedy, what's happened to me, what's happened to my life. But we'd far rather see it through the prism of tragedy than well, it's everything happens for a reason, or this is, who knows what's going on there. So we'll explore that as well. And then there's rebirth stories like A Christmas Carol, Lion King, Shawshank Redemption, Groundhog Day, which I'm a fan of. So it's interesting. What he says and argues is that every story worth telling fits into one of these 7 categories. And then, of course, he goes on to say, the better the story, the more plot lines it contains. So, you might have 2 or 3 as part of your book, your film, your story. And the greatest of all contain all 7 plot lines, which I might think of something like Lord of the Rings, right? It's just so great. But I also think that the Jesus Past story can be told as any of those 7 as well. And so
for sure.
That's what I want to explore the next few weeks. How the Jesus Past story can be framed as overcoming the monster, quest, voyage and return, that sort of thing. But what I'm hoping, Grace, is that it will also start to inform our narrative self, because we might not know what our story is immediately offhand, but we know, and you already pointed this out really well, we have an internal dialogue that is a heck of a storyteller.
Yes.
We tell ourselves stories about ourselves, and we might not be able to recognize them, but I hope by the end of this 8 weeks together here, Grace, that maybe whether someone comes to you or it's a random person at a party who says, hey, what's your story? You go, oh, okay. Well, currently in life, I'm really fighting a monster right now, or life feels like an absurd comedy, or going through grief right now. My life feels like a great tragedy. So anyway, that is my hope, what we will get to over the next 8 weeks. And if I could give just a brief snapshot of what each of these 7 plot overviews do. So overcoming the monster gives us a sense of there's some sort of external threat to defeat. Rags to Riches reminds us we have internal worth to discover. The quest prompts us to go on some kind of mission with companions. Voyage and Return takes us to an unfamiliar world that we can learn something from. Comedy is when the chaos of life somehow gets resolved into harmony. Tragedy can be flaws, but not just flaws or life circumstances leading to some sort of downfall. And then rebirth, of course, is death and resurrection into new life. So that's just a bit of a snapshot of where we're heading there, Grace.
I'm super excited about this teaser. I'm thrilled about season 3 on The Sacred Sofa. And like any good story, we hope you've enjoyed this introduction and outline for Narratology.
Yes.
Absolutely fantastic to be back with you, Brad. And thanks again to our listeners. And we will see you next time.
See you next time.